is a full-size Juno solar panel wing. So it's one of three, if you remember from the model. So it is a large spacecraft. And when it was launched, you can see the gaps in the panel. It was hinged and folded against the side of the spacecraft, so it could fit inside the nose cone of the rocket that blasted it off. It was an Atlas V. It was launched 5 years ago, so the thing has been cruising through the solar system for 5 years. It included a flyby of Earth, actually, so we launched from Earth and then flew by Earth a year or two later to get some more additional energy to fly out all the way to Jupiter. And it was a good test of the spacecraft systems, and took some pictures and things like that as well. Standing in front of that wing, so the wing itself is actually a thermal test model. So it was used to test the properties, the heat and cold of space. It doesn't have solar panels all the way across, but again, it's an engineering identical model. Sometimes you see flight hardware around here that are flight spares. They were used for testing but could have flown in space. This thing actually was just a ground-based testing model. Standing in front of it is High Bay Bob. So this building is a spacecraft assembly facility, and the room that you're looking at is called High Bay 1. We have another high bay called High Bay 2, very imaginatively. There's about 50 clean rooms or so around JPL. These are the largest, 1 and 2 in this building. So High Bay Bob is wearing what we generally refer to as a bunny suit. So the reason we have very high cleanliness standards in the clean room is to keep the nice clean spacecraft away from the dirty people. So no offense, but while you're standing here, there's stuff falling off of you. So you're losing hair and eyelashes and skin cells and lint off your clothing and things like that, none of which are good for space exploration. So we protect our spacecraft from the people in order to do two things. One is you don't want stuff into mechanical systems or anything like that. You also don't want to get anything that could outgas when it gets into outer space. So an excellent example of that is fingerprints, because the oils in your finger, if you touch something, when you get up into space with the vacuum of space and the cold and hot temperatures, what will happen is that material will volatilize, basically. It'll become a gas and float around. And like you know from condensation on the outside of a cold glass of water, what it's doing is it's pulling the moisture out of the air and it's collecting or condensing against the glass. The coldest thing that you've got on a spacecraft is generally going to be optical surfaces, lenses and mirrors. And the last thing you want to do is have any contamination on an optical surface. So what you'll do is you'll have a cover over the optics, and when the spacecraft gets into space, you'll leave that covered for a period of maybe days or weeks or months, and then when you're confident that all of the materials have outgassed off the spacecraft, then you'll flip up that cover. We used to just eject them, but in Earth orbit that means you've got a lens cover that's going 17,500 miles an hour in orbit, and that's a hazard. So now we retain all of our devices like that, so it'll be a lens cover that'll pop up. In the case of a deep space spacecraft, same thing, you just wait for some period of time. So we minimize the amount of things that could outgas or volatilize on the spacecraft itself. That's one way to avoid ever having a problem in the first place. The other reason for doing cleanroom stuff is many of the spacecraft that we send, like Mars rovers, are going to a surface that may potentially have life. Now, the Juno spacecraft is going to orbit around Jupiter. That's not a problem. Jupiter isn't going to have life on it, although there's some speculation about balloon floating kinds of organisms. But at the end of the mission, we're going to crash the spacecraft into Jupiter because we don't want our spacecraft as a derelict in orbit around Jupiter having any chance of landing on any of the moons, in particular Europa, but also Ganymede and Callisto. These are places that have salty liquid water oceans. In the case of Europa, it's the second of the 4 Galilean satellites. There's twice as much water on Europa as there is on Earth. And so there's cometary material that has organic compounds, carbon-based compounds, and amino acids that can fall onto Europa, and those materials can be modified by radiation. There's evidence that the ice melts periodically, so that means that the material on the surface can be delivered to the interior from tidal flexing, just sort of like bending a paperclip back and forth gets hot. Well, this moon is caught in a tug of war with Jupiter and its own orbit and the other moons, so it's flexing enough to create heat in the interior to melt the ocean. So you've got an energy source, you've got organic materials, you've got a liquid water ocean. So there could be sea monsters swimming around in the oceans of Europa. So what are the likelihood of sea monsters on Europa? Pretty remote. But eventually we're going to have a mission launched in 2021 right now that's going to orbit Europa to help us characterize the thickness of the ice. We're looking at putting a lander down on the surface, but eventually we'll put a lander down that will melt its way through the ice and then release a little mini sub that will be able to explore the deep ocean vents on Europa. So what I tell students when they come here is that my hope is that that they'll come back, they'll get degrees in science and engineering, and they'll work on a Europa mission, and that before I die, I'll have a chance to see the last picture of Europa, which will be from the headlight. It'll be dark underneath the ice, of course, so the headlight from the hydrobot that's swimming around in Europa, and the last picture will be like of teeth above and below, and then it'll go. Then the signal will stop. So I told them that's their goal. Their goal is to get me that picture there of the sea monsters on Europa. So we'll see about that. But for places that have any, so we'll take for spacecraft like Juno. We did this for Galileo. We're going to do it for the Cassini spacecraft, which is an orbit around Saturn. Is if we have deep space spacecraft, we basically burn them up in the atmosphere of the primary object, so there's no chance that any spores that have been hiding out on the spacecraft, even after years in space, would have any chance of reaching a place where they might land, and they might say, hey, this is kind of cool, and get started and generate life where it otherwise wouldn't be. Or in the case of these environments, including Mars, we could deliver organisms to the surface of Mars, or a planet. They could not only flourish in that environment, but they could attack the indigenous Martians. So if there's microbes living on Mars, through natural selection, our organisms may be able to outcompete and render extinct the indigenous Martians, which would be being a bad neighbor, or we could be like a plague or something like that for them. We could provide something that's essentially a disease. And so neither of those is scientifically ethical, so we're not going to do that. So we sterilize our spacecraft, and we have protections to make sure that we're not delivering terrestrial organisms to potentially biologically active places. Now that said, we have evidence of life in only one place, and it's us here. But there's a lot of opportunity out there, and our strategy has been to follow the water, because wherever you find water on Earth, and it doesn't have to be fresh water, you find an environment that is potentially conducive to life. And life is very tenacious. There's organisms, bacteria that live in jet fuel and radioactive and cooling water for nuclear reactors and radioactive environments. There's now substantial evidence of organisms that use chemical energy to live in the ground beneath us. And by one estimate, and this is from diamond mines and other places that are down deep, where every once in a while they'll hit they'll cut into an area that's a horizontal stream of water that's flowing underneath the ground, and these have organisms in them, and they've evolved very differently than organisms at the surface. So it's still carbon-based DNA, but it's still very different. And some estimates are there's as much biomass in the ground below our feet as there is at the surface. And so when we start to explore these ideas of what does life need and how does life get started, and we look on this planet, we're surprised continuously by how tenacious and what kind of environments we find life. So we're not going to prejudge extraterrestrial locations too early. So the idea for Mars, it's red, it's dead, we're too late. No, not so much. Now we think there could be organisms living in salty water a couple of meters or more below the surface, where salty water is not a problem, but being below the surface protects them from freezing or from the radiation from the surface. So there could be organisms living below the surface on Mars. So we're not going to mess with that environment until we can drill and examine a lot of locations and determine, if we can, once and for all. So people say, yeah, we should send human beings to Mars. Well, we're walking nightmare of biological load. So there's, just think about the organisms in your intestines, in your gut that we live with. These are not human. They are alien to our bodies, but we live in a symbiosis with them. Well, imagine the first person who throws up on Mars is going to represent a biological load of unprecedented proportions there. So we have to think carefully about what we're doing and how we're going to go about doing it. So more on Mars exploration in the future. I'm not discouraging Mars exploration, mind you. I'm just saying we need to be careful about how we go about it. All right, so this clean room environment right here, to get in here, you have to have a bunny suit of some level of complexity. If you look on the floor across on the left side, on the far wall, you see this glass door right there? And some of you farther down, you can see there's a couple of doors. And on the wall are jacuzzi-like nozzles, and that's an air shower. So on the other side, and also below our feet here, there's a dressing room where you get out of your street clothes and put on your bunny suit, and then you walk into the air shower, and you basically push the button, put your hands up, and do the hokey pokey for about 30 seconds, and it blows whatever dust is on you off. That makes you a little bit cleaner to come into this environment. And so you want to minimize the number of people in here, so it's not like we can just bunny suit tours up and swing through. You want to minimize the amount of people inside. The cleanliness on the other side of the glass is better than a hospital operating room. So that's an environment also where you want to minimize the amount of other things floating around. So to get things in and out of here, what we do is we box them up and we move them to this large door on the left side. There's a vertical floor-to-ceiling sliding door that opens into an airlock. It's basically a transfer aisle where we can open that door, move stuff in, close that door, and then open a door on the far side that goes to the outside world. So when we build spacecraft up in here, we have to take them to our testing area, environmental test area, which we call shake and bake, and that's up the hill. So we box things up, take them out the door, bring them up the hill on a convoy, and then bring them back in here, and then eventually box stuff up and send it either to the Kennedy Space Center for launch, or Vandenberg Air Force Base, or possibly fly it overseas to launch on someone else's launch vehicle. So we protect the cleanliness of this environment. On the back wall, you can see the badges there of all the spacecraft that have been built up in this building over time, going back to the 1960s. And so the next thing coming in here is going to be the Mars 2020 rover, which is a reflight of Curiosity. So on the panel, just above, you see that there's a television monitor on the wall. S, it says S right there. That means south. That's a crane operator direction. So you don't want to say a little to the left or right. We use north, south, east, and west. So south is that direction. So in that panel above and to the left on the bottom row, you can see on the left side it says Mars Science Laboratory. So that's a Curiosity rover, which is currently on the surface of Mars, doing very well, thank you very much. So we're going to refly that flight system again with, mechanically it's going to be identical, but with a different set of science instruments and some different science goals. So it's scheduled to launch in 2020, so if we come back in about 2018 or so, the floor in here is going to be dedicated to 2020 components. And if you come in here, there'll be stuff all over the place, but it'll be like, I dare you to find the rover. So there's components everywhere. It's only late in the game that everything comes together. And very late in the game, they put it all together as a flight system, and I had a good fortune to be in here the first time Curiosity actually drove. And so it was just on some flat surfaces, and they had to go up over a bump, but it was kind of cool. This place was packed, as you can imagine. So the Curiosity rover is going to be in here next. There's this large silvery thing down below you here, this large disc. That's actually a heat shield. It's the spare heat shield for Curiosity, and I believe it's the flight heat shield for 2020. So the good news is what you're looking at there down on the floor is flight hardware. That's going to go to Mars. The bad news is it's not going to survive the trip. So when you get to Mars, what you do, there's a cruise ring that has solar panels on it. That separates away, and it burns up in the atmosphere. And then what's left is the rover inside a heat shield with a back shell on it. And so the heat shield is the business end of the reentry, and for a period of several minutes, it actually is bearing the brunt of the deceleration due to friction. And then when we reach the point where we're slow enough we can deploy the parachute, we pop the parachute out, the heat shield falls away and falls onto the surface. And when it hits, it basically smacks pretty hard. So the Opportunity rover, one of the Mars exploration rovers, which landed in 2004, actually visited its heat shield, and the thing had hit and popped inside out, and there's chunks lying on the surface and springs, and it's like, I always thought of the spacecraft left behind as kind of artifacts, like museum exhibits of the future. I saw that, and it's kind of like, yeah, we're kind of littering too. So, so this thing is going to smack onto the surface of Mars and break up in some fashion, but kind of cool to see something that's going to live on Mars. And eventually, maybe we'll get to vacation on Mars. So the Viking 1 lander that landed on July 20th of 1976, it now belongs to the National Air and Space Museum. And there's a engineering model at the museum, and there's a plaque. And the idea is whoever goes to the Viking 1 landing site next, or first, or whatever, should take the plaque and affix it on the rover there, so everyone knows that it's an exhibit for the National Air and Space Museum. One of the things I think you saw in the JPL 101 presentation was about JPL that we can do the entire mission life cycle here, except for launching rockets. So we can start off with sparky ideas on a paper napkin, and then building 301 behind us here, it has our project design center where you can actually develop an idea, see whether it's a viable concept or not, and do all the fundamental engineering to make sure you can put together a coherent mission. And then do the detailed engineering and science, fabrication, assembly, testing, and then ship it off to the Cape, and then mission operations and science data analysis. We can do all of that here. If you had 6.5 hours to tour and didn't mind walking 8 miles, we could actually walk through the life cycle in order. So you're seeing things out of sequence. So again, kind of have that idea that there's a process, there's a flow to the way we do space missions, but it's not the order in which I'm showing you things here today. So by the time you get into spacecraft assembly, you're way down the line, and there's actually more energy spent and more time and workforce hours spent on the engineering design work than there is on the actual fabrication and assembly. So you may spend 2 years of development in here, but there's 3 years of engineering and concurrent engineering that's taking place to get to this point. Okay, so from here, what we're going to do is we're going to retrace our steps a little bit here and go to Spaceflight Operations Facility, which is going to be where all the action is on Monday night.